The smell of cold concrete and cigarette smoke hit Ethan Caldwell the moment he stepped out of the black SUV 3 blocks away from his own family's estate. He had planned this for months. Rehearsed it in his mind during sleepless nights in his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed 40 floors below him. He had imagined every possible reaction, the shock, the confusion, maybe even the laughter. What he had not imagined, what he had never once allowed himself to consider, was indifference. But he wasn't there yet. Right now, he was standing on the corner of Whitmore Avenue and 5th, adjusting the torn collar of a jacket that smelled like it had been dragged through a dumpster, because it had. He'd bought it from a second-hand bin outside a church charity shop in Brooklyn, along with a pair of worn-out boots that were one size too small and a pair of gray cargo trousers with a rip running from the left knee all the way down to the ankle. He looked at himself in the dark reflection of a closed pharmacy window. He didn't recognize himself. That was the point. Ethan Caldwell, 31 years old, was the only son of Gerald Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Industries, a real estate and private equity empire worth an estimated $4.7 billion. Ethan himself sat on the board, managed 3 of the company's most profitable subsidiaries, and had been featured in Forbes magazine twice before the age of 30. His face was known. His name was known. In certain circles, his shadow alone carried weight. But tonight, that man didn't exist. Tonight, he was just a homeless man named Ed, unshaved, unwashed, wearing borrowed suffering on his back like a costume he wasn't sure he deserved to wear. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small burner phone he'd purchased for cash at a bodega in Queens. One contact saved. His closest friend and the only person alive who knew the full truth of what he was doing tonight, Marcus Webb, his college roommate and current VP of Caldwell Industries Eastern Division. He typed, "I'm here." Marcus replied within seconds, "You sure about this, man? There's still time to turn back." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment. Then he typed back, "I've never been more sure of anything." He pocketed the phone and began walking. The Caldwell estate sat behind wrought iron gates at the end of a private road in Westchester County, New York. 3 acres of manicured lawn, a 7-bedroom Georgian manor house, a guest cottage, a pool house, and a garage that housed 7 cars ranging from a 1967 Ford Mustang to a Rolls-Royce Phantom. It was the kind of house that didn't just say money, it whispered it, quietly and constantly, in the language of perfectly trimmed hedgerows and marble fountain statues. Ethan had grown up here. He had ridden his bicycle down that private road at age 8, scraped his knees on that gravel driveway at 10, had his first heartbreak on the back porch at 17. This house was supposed to be home. Supposed to be. He didn't walk up to the main gate. He knew the camera angles better than the security team did. He'd reviewed them himself after a breach scare 3 years ago. Instead, he circled around to the eastern side of the property, where the old stone wall had a section that had been repaired poorly after a storm in 2019. The mortar was soft. The stones shifted just enough. He'd used it as a shortcut as a teenager, sneaking back from late nights he wasn't supposed to have. He used it again now. He dropped into the garden on the other side, landing silently on the grass. The main house was lit up warmly ahead of him. Through the large bay windows of the dining room, he could see movement, figures, candlelight, the glimmer of the chandelier. Of course. His mother's weekly Thursday dinner. A tradition she had maintained without interruption for over 20 years. It was a Thursday. He hadn't planned that. Or maybe some part of him had. He moved carefully around the perimeter of the garden, staying close to the tree line, his worn boots making almost no sound on the soft earth. He needed to reach the kitchen entrance, the side door that the household staff used. That was his way in. He had rehearsed this too. 3 months ago, Ethan had quietly dismissed the household's longtime kitchen assistant under the guise of a staffing agency reshuffle. The position had been quietly left open, with only the head housekeeper, Mrs. Patricia Osei, aware that a temporary replacement was being sourced through an external agency. What Mrs. Osei did not know was that Ethan had intercepted the agency communication and arranged for the temporary workers' paperwork to show a man named Edmund Cole. A fictional identity, built carefully over 8 weeks with Marcus's help, complete with references, a work history, and a social security number that would pass a basic background check. He was Edmund Cole tonight. And Edmund Cole was about to start his first shift as a kitchen hand at the Caldwell estate. He reached the side door and knocked twice, the way the agency had told him Real applicants knocked, apparently. A beat of silence. Then the door swung open and Mrs. Osei stood in the warm yellow light of the kitchen, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, a clipboard in her hand. Mrs. Osei had worked for the Caldwell family for 19 years. She had known Ethan since he was 12 years old. She had packed his school lunches, sewn buttons back onto his blazers, and once, during the worst year of his life, when everything had fallen apart, sat beside him on the back steps and said nothing for 4 to 5 minutes while he cried without knowing why. She looked at him now. At the stubbled jaw, the dirty jacket, the worn boots, the red woolen cap pulled low over his forehead. At the slightly stooped posture he'd practiced in a mirror for 2 weeks. She looked. And she saw nothing. "Edmund Cole," she said, glancing at her clipboard. "Yes, he said. He had altered his voice slightly, just a touch lower, a hint of a Midwestern flatness that wasn't his own. She studied him for one more second. Her eyes, sharp, intelligent, the eyes of a woman who had seen everything this family had to offer and then some, moved over his face. He held his breath. "Come in," she said. "You're 4 minutes late. Don't let it happen again." He exhaled slowly as he followed her inside. The Caldwell kitchen was exactly as he remembered it, warm and enormous, smelling of roasted garlic and fresh bread, the long stainless steel counters gleaming under recessed lighting. 2 other staff members were working, a young woman named Daniela who was plating appetizers with focused precision, and an older man named Robert who was stirring something on the stove and humming quietly to himself. Neither of them looked up when Ethan entered. "Robert, Daniela, this is Edmund, the temp from the agency," Mrs. O'Shea said briskly. "Edmund, you'll be responsible for washing up, prep assistance, and service support if needed. Do not go into the dining room unless I tell you to. Do you understand?" "Understood," Ethan said. "Good." She handed him an apron from a hook by the door. "Put this on and start on the prep sink. There are vegetables that need washing." And just like that, Ethan Caldwell, son of the man who owned this house, board member of the company that funded every item in this kitchen, inheritor of a $4 billion empire, began washing carrots in his family's kitchen while his family sat 30 feet away in the dining room, eating dinner without him. He worked quietly for the first 20 minutes, settling into the rhythm of the kitchen. Washing, rinsing, handing off vegetables to Daniela, who chopped them with mechanical efficiency. Robert plated the soup course without looking at him once. Mrs. O'Shea moved in and out of the kitchen with her clipboard, checking everything twice. It was almost meditative, Ethan thought. Almost peaceful. Then he heard his mother's laugh. It came drifting through the closed door to the dining room, light, musical, slightly performative in the way it always was when she had guests. His mother, Vivian Caldwell, née Hargrove, had a social laugh and a private laugh and they sounded completely different. The one coming through that door was the social one. He hadn't heard the private one in a long time. He kept washing vegetables. He kept his back to the door. He breathed slowly. Then the door swung open. He didn't turn around immediately. He heard footsteps, heels on the kitchen tile, crisp and purposeful, and then his mother's voice, up close now, speaking to Mrs. O'Shea. "Patricia, we're going to need more of the Bordeaux. Gregory brought his girlfriend and she drinks like it's her last evening on earth." A pause, and then the sound of a light laugh. "Also, can we do the dessert course 20 minutes earlier? Raymond has a car at 9. "Of course, Mrs. Caldwell," Mrs. O'Shea said. "I'll have Thomas bring another bottle immediately." "Perfect." A beat. Then, as if noticing him for the first time, "Who is this?" He turned around slowly. Vivian Caldwell was 61 years old and looked 50. Her dark hair, dyed, but expertly so, was swept back in a French twist. She wore a cream blazer over a silk blouse and a single strand of pearls that Ethan's father had given her on their 20th anniversary. She was beautiful in the specific, maintained way that wealth allows, not effortlessly, but expensively. She was looking at him. At Edmund Cole, in his apron and his dirty jacket underneath and his cap and his 2-day stubble. She was looking directly at her son. "This is Edmund, the temporary kitchen assistant from the agency," Mrs. O'Shea said smoothly. Vivian's gaze moved over him once, brief, polite, the way she looked at all household staff, which was to say, not quite as if they were invisible, but as if they were simply part of the furniture. Her expression showed nothing except mild, automatic courtesy. "Edmund," she said, the briefest nod. "Evening, he said. She turned back to Mrs. O'Shea. They discussed the wine. They discussed the dessert timing. She left the kitchen without looking at him again. The door swung closed behind her. Ethan stood very still for a moment. His hands were wet from the prep sink. The water was cold. He turned back to the sink and kept washing. He had not thought it would hurt this quickly. He had told himself, told Marcus, told himself again in the mirror during those long preparatory weeks, that this was an experiment. A controlled exercise in truth-seeking. He was a man who made data-driven decisions. He had watched too many people in his life make choices based on who they wanted their family to be, rather than who their family actually was. He was not going to be that man. He needed to know the truth about his family's character. The question had begun 3 years ago, on the night of his father's 63rd birthday party. 200 guests, the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, a jazz quartet and past hors d'oeuvres and a speech that Gerald Caldwell had given with tears in his eyes about legacy and family and love. It had been a beautiful speech. The room had been moved by it. Ethan had stood at the back of the room, champagne glass in hand, watching his father speak, and had felt nothing but a cold, creeping suspicion that none of it was real. The feeling had grown since then. Fed by small moments, overheard conversations, inconsistencies in the way his family behaved in public versus private. Fed, most of all, by a conversation he had accidentally overheard 8 months ago between his father and his stepbrother Gregory, a conversation conducted in low voices in Gerald's study, the door not quite fully closed, in which he had heard his own name used in a context that had made his blood run cold. He hadn't been able to make out every word. What he had heard was enough to make him certain that something had been kept from him. Something large. Something that changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. But he couldn't confront it directly. He tried once, years ago, to ask his father a direct question about the past, and Gerald Caldwell had deployed the full weight of his personality, the charm, the authority, the warmth, all wielded simultaneously like instruments, to redirect, deflect, and ultimately close the conversation so smoothly that Ethan had walked away feeling vaguely embarrassed for asking. He needed a different approach. He needed to see who these people were when they didn't know he was watching. So here he was. Washing carrots. Wearing a stranger's jacket. Listening to his mother laugh through a closed door. Around 8:30, the rhythm of the kitchen shifted. Daniela disappeared to handle something in the pantry, Robert stepped outside for a break, and Mrs. Osei was called to address a minor issue with the wine service. For approximately 11 minutes, Ethan was alone in the kitchen. He moved quickly but carefully to the door that connected the kitchen to the butler's pantry, a narrow room that ran alongside the dining room wall, connected to it by a small pass-through hatch that had been installed in the 1990s for more efficient service. The hatch was currently closed but not sealed. He stood in the butler's pantry and listened. The dining room on the other side of the thin wall was alive with conversation. He could hear his father's voice, deep, authoritative, the voice of a man who never had to raise it to command a room. He could hear Gregory's voice, his stepbrother, 4 years older than Ethan, the son of his father's first marriage to a woman named Donna who had died of cancer when Gregory was 9. Gregory's voice was the voice of a man who had spent his entire life performing ease he didn't actually feel. There were other voices too. A woman's voice he didn't recognize, Gregory's new girlfriend, presumably, the one who drank too much Bordeaux. And then another voice, male, slightly nasal, with the cadence of a man accustomed to delivering prepared remarks, Raymond. Raymond Holt, his father's attorney, who had been listed as a dinner guest in the household calendar that Ethan had quietly accessed before tonight. An attorney. At a family dinner. He pressed closer to the wall and listened. The conversation he heard for the first several minutes was unremarkable: property prices in the Hamptons, an upcoming charity gala, Gregory's new passion project that seemed to involve a vineyard in Napa and an amount of capital that made Ethan, even in his current state, wince slightly. His mother made gentle sounds of interest and approval at regular intervals. Then his father said his name. Ethan has been distant lately. Gerald's voice, measured, slightly lowered, the way it lowered when he wanted to signal that this was a more serious register of conversation. He missed the board dinner last month. Cancelled twice on the Whitmore meeting. A pause. Ethan held his breath. He's been that way for a while, Gregory said. The tone was light. Almost too light. You know how he gets. I don't think this is one of his moods, Gerald said. I think he's beginning to ask questions. Another pause. Longer this time. About what? Gregory asked. A beat. Raymond, Gerald said, do you want to? I don't think this is the time, Raymond's voice cut in, smooth and practiced. We have company. Of course, Gerald said. The conversation pivoted immediately, effortlessly, back to the Hamptons property and a dispute with a neighboring estate over a tree line. Ethan stood in the butler's pantry and did not move for a very long time. He's beginning to ask questions. That was what his father had said. Not, Ethan seems unhappy. Not, I'm worried about my son. But, he's beginning to ask questions. And Raymond Holt, his father's attorney, had been invited to a family dinner for reasons that had nothing to do with the Bordeaux. He heard the kitchen door open behind him and slipped back to the prep sink before Mrs. O'Shea reappeared, smoothing her clipboard as she walked. She looked at him. He looked at the sink. "The salad plates need clearing," she said. "Yes, he said. It was just after 9 o'clock when the moment happened that he would replay in his mind for months afterward. The dinner was moving into its final stage. Robert had gone in to clear the main course plates, and Ethan had been tasked with carrying a fresh tray of dessert glasses to the pass-through hatch, not going into the dining room, just placing them at the hatch for Robert to distribute. It was a logistical task. A simple one. He was at the hatch when he heard Gregory's voice clearly, closer than before, apparently standing near the far end of the dining room close to the connecting wall. Gregory was on his phone. "Yeah, no, it's still on." Gregory's voice was low, but not low enough. The thin wall of the butler's pantry gave Ethan the same hidden acoustic advantage it had given him earlier. "Dad handled it. The codicil is being drafted this week. Raymond's handling it." A pause. "No, Ethan doesn't know. He won't know until it's filed." Another pause, and then a small, controlled laugh. "That's the whole point, isn't it? By the time he figures it out, it'll already be done." The dessert glasses rattled very slightly on the tray. Ethan set the tray down before he could drop it. He stood in the butler's pantry, in the dark, in his dirty jacket and his worn boots and his borrowed suffering, and he felt something he had not expected to feel tonight. He had expected confirmation of coldness. He had expected the particular, clean pain of seeing your family look through you as if you don't exist. He had been prepared for that. He had steeled himself against it. He had not been prepared for this, for the sound of something actively being done to him, right now, in this house, while he stood 30 feet away and they laughed over Bordeaux and dessert. A codicil. A change to his father's will. He picked the tray back up. His hands were steady. He placed the glasses at the hatch. He walked back to the prep sink and stood there with his hands under the cold water and his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the drain. He would not react tonight. He had promised himself that. Tonight was observation only. But the ground beneath his feet had just shifted in a way he hadn't fully anticipated, and the story he had told himself, that this was a controlled experiment, that he could observe without being affected, that he could be scientific about his own family's betrayal, that story was getting much harder to maintain. At 10:15, the dinner guests began to leave. Raymond Holt was first, efficient, as always, out the door and into his car with minimal ceremony. Gregory's girlfriend was next, tottering slightly on heels that had seemed more manageable 5 glasses of wine ago. Gregory went with her, pressing a practiced kiss to his father's cheek and saying something in a low voice that made Gerald Caldwell nod once, slowly, before patting his older son on the shoulder. That pat on the shoulder. Ethan had seen it his entire life. The specific weight of it, the approval, the solidarity, the closed circuit of two people who shared something he was not part of, had always been visible to him. He had always told himself he was imagining it. He wasn't imagining it. The kitchen was quieter now. Mrs. O'Shea was tallying something on her clipboard. Daniela was washing up with her headphones in. Robert had gone home. Ethan was stacking clean dessert plates on the rack when the kitchen door opened again. His father walked in. Gerald Caldwell was 71 years old and looked it in the best possible way, silver-haired, straight-backed, the face of a man whose authority had calcified over decades into something resembling a natural feature of his appearance. He was still in his dinner jacket. He had a whiskey glass in his hand, and he moved through the kitchen with the comfortable ownership of a man who had owned things all his life. He was looking for Mrs. O'Shea. "Patricia, the alarm panel in the east wing is showing a fault again." He stopped. He was looking at Ethan. At the new kitchen hand, standing at the dish rack in his apron, his back slightly turned, that red woolen cap on his head. Ethan turned around slowly. And his father looked at him. Gerald Caldwell had known his son for 31 years. He had held him as an infant. He had taught him to ride a bike on this property. He had sat across from him at this house's dining room table for 31 years of dinners, holidays, arguments, and silences. He knew the line of his son's jaw and the way his son held his shoulders and the specific shade of dark brown in his son's eyes. He looked at Ethan. He held his whiskey glass. He saw a kitchen worker in an apron. "Do you know where Mrs. O'Shea is?" he asked. Ethan's throat tightened. He kept his posture. He kept his voice flat and Midwestern. "I think she went to the laundry room, sir. East corridor." His father nodded. His eyes moved over the dish rack once, checking, because Gerald Caldwell always checked, and then he turned and left the kitchen. The door swung shut. Ethan stood very still. He counted backward from 10 inside his head. A technique he'd learned in a stress management seminar years ago that he had never found useful until this precise moment. 10, 9, 8. He stared at the dish rack. 7, 6. The plates were clean. 5, 4. The kitchen smelled like roasted garlic and dish soap. 3, 2, 1. He was fine. He was not fine. He turned back to the dishes and kept working, and if Daniela noticed that his hands were shaking slightly for the next 10 minutes, she said nothing about it, because she had her headphones in and she wasn't looking at him anyway. Nobody in this house was looking at him. That was the point. That was the whole, terrible, clarifying point. He left the estate at 11:20. Mrs. Osei paid him in cash from the household petty fund, an envelope with three $50 bills, which she pressed into his hand at the side door with a brief, efficient nod. Agency will be in touch about next week's schedule, she said. Thank you, he said. She closed the door. He stood on the gravel path by the side entrance for a moment, the cold March air cutting through the jacket that was wrong for the season. The envelope with the $150 felt strange in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, then put it in his pocket. He walked back around the eastern edge of the property, climbed back over the wall at the loose mortared section, dropped down onto the road on the other side, and walked 3 blocks to where his car was waiting. Marcus was in the driver's seat. He'd insisted on driving. In case, he'd said, and Ethan hadn't argued because some part of him had understood in case of what. Ethan got into the passenger seat. He pulled off the woolen cap. He said nothing. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he started the car. They drove for 10 minutes in silence, the Westchester countryside giving way to early highway, the lights of the city beginning to glow in the distance. How bad? Marcus said finally. Ethan looked out the window. My father looked me in the eyes, he said quietly, and asked me where the housekeeper was. Silence. And Gregory is on the phone making arrangements about a codicil to the will. With Raymond Holt. He paused. They're changing something. I don't know what yet. But it's connected to whatever he was talking about in my father's study 8 months ago. He turned to look at Marcus. I need to find out what they are hiding. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? Ethan looked back out the window. The city lights were closer now. Somewhere out there, in a penthouse 40 floors above the street, his real life was waiting for him. His suits, his name, his power, all of it exactly where he'd left it. He'd thought, going into tonight, that the worst thing he might discover was that his family was shallow. Self-interested. That the love he'd grown up believing in was simply a performance, a social nicety, the emotional equivalent of the manicured lawns and the marble statues. But the codicil changed things. This wasn't just about character anymore. This was about something being taken from him. I go back, he said. As Edmund Cole. I go back until I find out what they are hiding. Ethan. There's something in that house, Ethan said. Something they don't want me to know. And now that I know it exists, I can't unknow it. He exhaled slowly. I go back. Marcus didn't argue. He knew when Ethan had made a decision. He'd known him for 12 years. He knew the particular quietness that settled over him in these moments, like the eye of something much larger. They drove the rest of the way to the city in silence. And in the pocket of Ethan's dirty jacket, the envelope with $150 in it sat like a small, quiet accusation. The price his own family had paid, unknowingly, for one evening of his labor. The price they'd put on a man they hadn't recognized as their own flesh and blood. He would cash it. He would keep it. Not for the money, he had more money than he could spend in 5 lifetimes. He would keep it because he needed to remember exactly how much his family thought he was worth when they couldn't see his name. 3 days later, the agency confirmed Edmund Cole for the following Thursday. He texted Marcus, it's on. And somewhere across the city, in a corner office that had his name on the door, a different version of him was already disappearing. The version who believed that family was unconditional, that blood meant something, that the people who raised you could always, in the end, be trusted. That version of Ethan Caldwell was already gone. What was left was quieter, more patient, and far, far more dangerous. The second Thursday came with rain. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind that announces itself with thunder and sets the mood like a film score. This was the other kind, gray, persistent, indifferent, the kind of rain that doesn't care about your story and falls the same way on the grieving and the joyful and the quietly devastated. It had been raining since Tuesday and showed no interest in stopping. Ethan stood at the same corner of Whitmore Avenue and 5th, in the same jacket, the same boots, the same red woolen cap. He had washed the jacket this time. He wasn't method enough to suffer unnecessarily, but he'd made sure it still looked wrong, still carried the specific texture of a life that had accumulated in the wrong direction. He'd re-scuffed the boots against the curb outside his apartment building at 6 in the morning while his housekeeper watched from the doorway with an expression of profound professional neutrality. He'd added something new this week. A small detail, suggested by Marcus after a long conversation on Sunday evening that had moved between strategy and something more uncomfortable, something closer to genuine worry. A scar. Not a real one. A theatrical prosthetic, flesh-colored latex applied along the left jawline, just below the ear. Subtle enough to look accidental, significant enough to alter the overall read of his face. Marcus had researched it, ordered it, and delivered it to Ethan's apartment in an unmarked box with a note that said, "Just in case someone looks too hard this time." Ethan had applied it in the bathroom mirror that morning, pressing it carefully into place with the spirit gum, and then stood back and looked at himself for a long time. He looked like a stranger who had once been through something. He felt like one, too. He checked the burner phone. A message from Marcus, sent at 6:50, "Call me before you go in. I found something." He dialed. Marcus picked up on the second ring. There was background noise, an office, or maybe a car. "You're early," Marcus said. "What did you find?" A brief pause. The background noise shifted. He heard a door close, and then the background disappeared entirely, replaced by that specific thick silence of a soundproofed room, which meant Marcus was in his office with the door shut and the privacy screen on, which meant whatever he had found was not for open air. "I've been going through the company's legal filing records," Marcus said. "Specifically anything Raymond Holt's firm has filed on behalf of Caldwell Industries or the Caldwell Family Trust in the last 18 months. And? Most of it's routine. Property transfers, tax restructuring, the usual. But there's one filing that I can't get full visibility into because it's been sealed under a private trust instrument, which is legal, but unusual. It's a modification to the Caldwell Family Discretionary Trust." Ethan said nothing. He stood in the rain and listened. "The trust was established in 1994, Marcus continued. You were 3 years old. It holds approximately 40% of the total family estate, real estate, securities, private equity positions. The original instrument named 3 beneficiaries, Vivian Caldwell, Gregory Caldwell, Anne. Me, Ethan said. You. Ethan Gerald Caldwell. A beat. The modification filing is dated 11 weeks ago. I can't see the full content because of the seal, but I can see the filing category. It's classified as a beneficiary amendment. The rain fell. A taxi went past, its headlights sweeping briefly across the wet pavement. "They're removing me from the trust," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. He'd known it since the butler's pantry. He was simply saying it out loud for the first time, giving it the weight of spoken language. "I think so," Marcus said carefully. "I can't confirm it without seeing the document itself. But the timing, the secrecy, Gregory's phone call," he stopped. "Ethan. There's something else." "Say it." "The trust was established in 1994. You were 3. But," Marcus paused, and in that pause Ethan heard something he had never heard from Marcus before in 12 years of friendship. Hesitation. Not tactical hesitation, not the pause of a man choosing his words for effect. The hesitation of someone who wasn't sure he should be the one delivering what came next. The original trust documentation lists your full legal name as Ethan Gerald Caldwell. But the property deed for your childhood bedroom in the estate, which I found in the county recorder's archive, its public record, lists the occupant minor as Ethan Gerald Caldwell, formally registered under a prior legal designation. The rain seemed to get louder. "What prior legal designation?" Ethan asked. Another pause. "That's the part one can't access," Marcus said quietly. "It's been expunged from the public record. Whatever name you were registered under before the Caldwells formally named you Ethan Gerald Caldwell, it's been removed from every accessible document I can find. Professionally, thoroughly removed." He exhaled. "That's not something you do casually, Ethan. That takes intention and resources and a very specific reason." Ethan stood on the wet pavement and said nothing. A prior legal designation. A name that had been scrubbed from the record. Not just a nickname, not just a clerical revision, an expunged registration, the kind that required legal process and deliberate effort. He thought about his father's voice in the dining room, his beginning to ask questions. He thought about Gregory on the phone. By the time he figures it out, it'll already be done. He thought about every photograph in that house, the careful, curated gallery of Caldwell family history that ran along the upstairs hallway, 37 framed photographs spanning 4 decades. He had walked past those photographs his entire life. He knew every face in them. He had never once questioned why there were no photographs of him before the age of 4. He had never questioned it because it had simply been there, a gap in the record, unremarkable the way all familiar absences are unremarkable when you grow up with them. You don't notice the shape of what isn't there. "I'm going in," he said. "Ethan. I need to find that document. You're a kitchen hand. You're not going to have access to your father's private study." "I grew up in that house," Ethan said. "I know every room. I know the study. I know where my father keeps his important documents." He paused. "I know where he keeps his personal files." A long silence from Marcus. Then, "If you get caught." "I won't get caught." "If you do." "Then I get caught," Ethan said. "And my father has to look at me and explain why his personal files contain a document about his son's expunged legal identity." He paused. "Either way, I get the answer." He hung up before Marcus could argue further. Mrs. Osei opened the side door at 4 minutes past 7, which meant he was technically on time this week. She looked at him the same way she had looked at him the first time, the efficient, cataloging look of a woman assessing a resource. She looked at the jacket, the boots, the cap. She looked at his face. Her eyes moved across the prosthetic scar for just a fraction of a second. Then she stepped back and let him in. "You're on time," she said, which from Patricia Osei was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. "Trying to improve," he said. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, moved across her face. She handed him his apron. Tonight was different from last week. There was no dinner party. The household calendar, which Ethan had again quietly accessed, showed a quiet Thursday, just Gerald and Vivian at home. Gregory was in the city. The attorney Raymond Holt was, as far as Ethan could tell, nowhere near the property tonight. This was, in many ways, more dangerous than the dinner party. Fewer people meant more visibility. Fewer people meant more likelihood of running into family members in corridors, in rooms, in the particular way that a quiet house closes the distance between people without warning. But it was also, in one specific way, an opportunity. His father had a routine. It had never changed in 30 years, as far as Ethan could tell. On evenings when he had no social obligations, Gerald Caldwell ate dinner at 7:30, watched the financial news in the sitting room until 8:15, and then retreated to his study on the second floor where he spent 2 hours reviewing correspondence and documents before bed. The study was locked when he wasn't in it. When he was in it, he locked it from the inside. But he was predictable about one thing. At 9:15 every night, without fail, Gerald Caldwell went to the kitchen for his nightly glass of warm milk. It was the most human thing about him, this nightly ritual, this slightly old-fashioned comfort, this evidence that beneath the silver hair and the authority and the empire there was a man who needed warm milk to sleep. Ethan had teased him about it once, gently, years ago. His father had smiled and said that some habits are worth keeping. It had been, Ethan thought now in the rain-wet kitchen, one of the last genuinely warm moments he could remember between them. Gerald Caldwell would leave his study at 9:15. He would be in the kitchen for approximately 6 to 8 minutes. He would leave the study unlocked when he went for his milk because he always did. Ethan knew this from years of growing up in the house, from the dozens of times he'd knocked on the study door after 9 only to find it standing slightly ajar. That was his window. 6 to 8 minutes. The evening passed slowly. Ethan worked the kitchen, prepping, washing, moving with the quiet efficiency that he'd discovered over the last week felt surprisingly natural. There was something almost meditative about physical, repetitive work. He understood, in a way he hadn't before, why people found it grounding. You were entirely in your body. Your mind was free to move while your hands did what was required. His mind was very busy. At 7:45, he heard his mother's voice in the corridor. She was speaking to Mrs. Osei about a floral arrangement for the weekend. Her voice moved closer to the kitchen door and then away, fading back toward the dining room. He kept his head down. At 8:30, Robert went home. Daniela finished her shift at 8:45, left with a brief nod in his direction, and was gone. Mrs. Osei came and went twice more, checking the refrigerator inventory and confirming the next morning's breakfast requirements with the mechanical thoroughness that was her defining characteristic. By 9 o'clock, the kitchen was his. He waited. 9:12. 9:13. 9:14. At 9:15 and approximately 20 seconds, he heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the familiar, specific creak of the third step on the main staircase, the one that had creaked his entire life, the one his father had always promised to have fixed and never did. His father's footsteps on the staircase, measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man descending into his own home at his own pace in his own time. Ethan moved. He slipped off his apron and hung it on the hook. He crossed the kitchen to the interior door that connected to the main house corridor, the door that staff were not supposed to use. He opened it quietly, checked the corridor, and stepped through. The main house was warm and dimly lit at this hour, the sconces along the corridor turned down to their evening setting. He could hear the television in the sitting room, his mother, presumably, watching something with the volume low. He could hear his father in the kitchen now, the specific sounds of the milk being heated on the stove.